On the morning of December 18th, 1988, 13 men were buried alive beneath 230,000 cubic yards of snow on Ridge Pass in northwestern Wyoming. All adults, all wealthy, all members of the same Denver hunting club. The method was an artificially triggered avalanche, calculated, engineered, and executed with precision. The perpetrators were the Bennett family, a father and his 3 sons. Fourth-generation Wyoming ranchers who understood mountain physics. The Wyoming State Police would later call it the most sophisticated mass murder in the state's history. But the motive wasn't a dispute over hunting rights, wasn't poaching territory, wasn't retaliation for violence. It was 640 acres of ancestral land being foreclosed and sold to developers. And one man's unshakable belief that some violations demanded answers, written in ice and stone and silence. If you have the courage to hear this story, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. But I warn you, this narrative contains extreme violence based on real events. Teton County, Wyoming sprawled across 4,008 square miles in 1988. The county sat in the northwestern corner where the Teton Range rose like ancient teeth, peaks reaching over 13,700 feet. Population stood at 11,172, scattered across landscape where wilderness outnumbered people. The county seat Jackson held barely 5,000 souls who knew each other's trucks and recognized family names, going back to the 1880s. December meant temperatures dropping to 5 degrees Fahrenheit at night, climbing to maybe 25 by mid-afternoon. The air smelled like wood smoke from stoves burning lodgepole pine, the sharp scent of snow so cold it squeaked under boots, and that metallic quality of altitude. At night, when the sky cleared, you could see stars so bright they looked like scattered salt. The silence was complete. You could hear your heartbeat, ice forming on the Snake River 3 miles away, and sometimes, if the wind was right, the distant crack of a tree splitting from cold. But 1988 was devastating. The transformation that would turn Jackson Hole from ranching community into billionaire's playground was underway. Real estate developers from California and Texas had discovered the valley. Property values exploded. Land that ranching families had valued at $500 per acre was selling for $2,000. The old economy built on cattle and hard, sustainable work was being replaced by trophy homes and vacation ranches. Sound traveled strangely in those mountains. Sometimes you'd hear a chainsaw 4 miles away, clear as if it was next door. Other times you wouldn't hear a man shouting 50 feet behind you. But what you could always hear in December was the wind. It came down from high country carrying the smell of snow that hadn't fallen yet. At 9,000 feet, where Ridge Pass cut through the mountains, that wind could reach 60 miles per hour on a calm day. On a bad day, it could knock a full-grown man off his feet, could drive snow horizontally, could create whiteout conditions. The wind created conditions where avalanches hung, waiting for the smallest disturbance to release energy that had been building for weeks. The pass itself was a natural funnel, barely 200 yards wide at its narrowest point, with slopes rising 3,000 vertical feet on either side. Unstable slopes that held snow in delicate balance. Thomas William Bennett was 61 years old that December, though he looked closer to 70. He stood 6 feet even but stooped forward from 4 decades of ranch work. His face was weathered like old boot leather. Deep lines carved around his eyes from 40 years of squinting into sun reflecting off snow. A scar ran along his left temple, a souvenir from Vietnam, a piece of shrapnel that had missed his eye by less than an inch during the Tet Offensive in January 1968. He walked with a slight limp legacy of the same explosion that had killed 2 men standing beside him. His hands were massive, knuckles swollen from arthritis that started in his 30s, fingers permanently curved from decades of gripping reins and tools and rifles in temperatures cold enough to freeze skin to metal. When he shook your hand, you felt the strength there, but also the damage, the accumulated cost of a life spent doing physical work in a place that demanded everything. Every morning, Thomas woke at 4:45 in the house his great-grandfather had built in 1882. He made coffee in a percolator so old the bottom was worn thin and sat at the kitchen table reading from a leather-bound Bible his grandmother had given him in 1946. He'd read 1 chapter, drink his coffee, black and strong, then step outside to watch the sun come up over the Tetons. He'd smoke 1 cigarette, unfiltered Camel, and then he'd start his day. Check the cattle in the south pasture, break ice on water tanks, distribute hay, fix whatever had broken overnight. He'd married Catherine Rose McAllister in 1950, right after his discharge from the Army. She was 18, he was 23, and they'd known each other since childhood. They had 3 sons. Robert was 33 now, married to Ellen, father of 2 daughters. James was 30, back from Vietnam with nightmares that never quite left. Michael was 27, the youngest who'd tried college in Laramie but came home. What Thomas valued most wasn't the money the ranch generated, though God knew they needed every dollar just to survive the margins that kept getting thinner. What he valued was legacy. His great-grandfather, Ezra Bennett, had homesteaded the land in 1882 under the Homestead Act, claiming 640 acres along Ridge Creek. Ezra had been 24 years old, newly arrived from Montana with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and the kind of determination the frontier demanded. He'd built the first cabin with logs he cut himself, had survived the winter of 1883 when temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and stayed there for 6 weeks, had slowly turned wilderness into something resembling a working ranch. That land wasn't just property to the Bennett family. It was identity. It was the only thing of value they'd ever created, the only inheritance Thomas could pass to his children. The specific 640 acres held significance beyond economics. Ezra Bennett was buried there in a small family cemetery on a ridge overlooking the creek. Thomas's grandfather, William Bennett, was buried beside him. Thomas's father, Robert Bennett Sr., was buried there too, died in 1976 of a heart attack while checking fence line at age 73. The land held 4 generations of family history. Every fence post had been set by Bennett hands. Every irrigation ditch had been dug by Bennett labor. The barn that still stood weathered gray and leaning slightly south had been raised in 1903 by Ezra and his 3 brothers. The house expanded and modified, but still fundamentally the same structure, contained rooms where Bennett children had been born, where Bennett parents had died, where every significant moment of family history had occurred within walls that smelled like wood smoke and coffee and the accumulated decades of lives lived in one place. For Thomas, selling that land would be like selling his own children. It would be erasing everyone who'd come before him. It would be admitting that 4 generations of backbreaking work meant nothing, that heritage and legacy and connection to place were just sentimental concepts with no real value in a world where only money mattered, where land was just another commodity to be bought and sold to the highest bidder without regard for what it represented. To the people who'd worked it for a century, the Bennett sons understood this without discussion because they'd been raised in it. Robert Thomas Bennett, the oldest at 33, stood 6 feet 2 inches tall, built solid from a lifetime of ranch work, with his father's weathered face and his mother's steady temperament. He'd married Ellen Mackenzie in 1978, a local girl whose family ran cattle 20 miles south near Hoback Junction. They had 2 daughters, Sarah, age 9, and Jennifer, age 6, both enrolled at the elementary school in Jackson. Robert was the steady one, the son who never questioned, who simply did what needed doing without complaint or drama. He woke every morning at 5, was feeding cattle by 5:30, worked until dark, with the kind of methodical efficiency that comes from doing the same tasks for decades. He didn't talk much, communicated in grunts and nods, but when he spoke, people listened because he never wasted words. James Edward Bennett, 30 years old, was different. He stood 6 feet even, leaner than his older brother, with a kind of coiled intensity that came from places he'd been and things he'd seen. Vietnam had marked him in ways that went beyond the scar tissue on his back, where shrapnel had caught him during a firefight near Hue in 1972. He'd come home in 1973 with nightmares and a drinking problem that he mostly controlled but never quite conquered. He'd never married, lived in a small cabin on the ranch property that he'd built himself, worked alongside his father and brother, without discussion of what haunted him during the hours between midnight and dawn. He was the most dangerous of the 3 sons, not because he sought violence, but because violence no longer frightened him. He'd seen what men were capable of doing to each other when the rules disappeared and civilization was just a memory. He'd done things himself that he never spoke about, but that lived behind his eyes in moments when he thought no one was watching. Michael David Bennett, 27, was the youngest and the one who tried to leave. He'd gone to the University of Wyoming in Laramie, had studied range management, had seriously considered a different life working for the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service. But by his junior year, something pulled him back. Maybe it was guilt about leaving his brothers to handle the ranch work. Maybe it was the realization that everything he studied in textbooks was knowledge his father already possessed through lived experience. Maybe it was just the understanding that the Bennett Ranch was who he was, that leaving would be severing part of himself that could never be reattached. He came home in 1984 and it felt like he'd never left. The 3 sons worked together with the kind of unspoken coordination that comes from shared history and shared understanding of what mattered. They didn't need to discuss plans or coordinate schedules. They simply knew where each other would be, what needed doing, who would handle which tasks. Robert managed the cattle operation, James maintained equipment and handled the endless repairs that ranch life demanded. Michael dealt with the business side, the paperwork, the phone calls, the negotiations with buyers and suppliers. Together, they ran the ranch the way their father had taught them, the way his father had taught him, following patterns established over a century of working the same land under the same mountain sky. They were different men with different temperaments, but they shared one fundamental truth. The Bennett Ranch was their identity. It was what made them who they were. It was their past and their future rolled into 640 acres of creek bottom and meadow and forest that their great-great-grandfather had claimed when Wyoming was still territory. They would defend it the way their ancestors had defended it, with whatever force necessary. They didn't discuss this. They didn't need to. It was understood the way breathing was understood, the way gravity was understood. The land was theirs. It had always been theirs. It would always be theirs. And anyone who threatened that would learn exactly what Bennett men were capable of when pushed past the point where civilized responses remained possible. The winter of 1988 moved toward December with the inevitability of seasons in country where weather dictated everything. Snow fell. Temperatures dropped. The ranch continued its daily rhythm of chores and maintenance and the endless work that never quite finished. Thomas Bennett rose every morning at 4:45, made his coffee, read his Bible, smoked his cigarette, and watched the sun come up over mountains that had witnessed everything his family had built. He didn't know yet that everything was about to change. Didn't know that legal papers had already been filed in an office 300 miles away. Didn't know that the land his family had held for a century was already slipping through his fingers like snow through a fence. Didn't know that by Christmas, 13 men would be dead, and his family would be destroyed. He just did his morning routine like he'd done for 40 years. Drank his coffee, watched the sunrise, started his day. The Denver Hunting Club had been making annual trips to Teton County for 12 years by 1988. 13 men, all successful, all connected through business networks and country club memberships that defined a certain stratum of Colorado society. They weren't cruel men or evil men. They were simply men who'd succeeded in a world where success was measured in money and property and the ability to purchase experiences that regular people couldn't afford. Richard Allen Hartwell led the group. He was 52 years old, 6 feet tall, built thick around the middle from decades of expense account dinners and business lunches where deals were closed over steak and scotch. He'd made his fortune in commercial real estate development, turning vacant lots in Denver suburbs into shopping centers and office parks and apartment complexes that generated steady income. His net worth in 1988 exceeded $12 million. He owned a house in Cherry Hills Village, worth $1.2 million, drove a Mercedes sedan, belonged to the Denver Country Club, served on charitable boards. He was married to Patricia for 28 years, had 3 adult children, attended church most Sundays. By conventional measures, he was a good man who'd worked hard and earned his success. The other 12 men in the hunting club followed similar patterns. James Mitchell, 47, corporate attorney specializing in mergers and acquisitions. David Preston, 51, investment banker. Robert Keller, 49, orthopedic surgeon. Thomas Chen, 45, owner of a commercial construction company. William Foster, 53, insurance executive. Mark Anderson, 46, real estate broker. Stephen Walsh, 48, pharmaceutical sales director. Daniel Murphy, 50, owner of an automotive dealership. Charles Harrison, 47, tax attorney. Jeffrey Coleman, 49, stockbroker. Paul Richardson, 52, dentist with 3 practices. Anthony Martinez, 44, youngest of the group. commercial pilot. They'd met through various business and social connections over the years, had discovered shared interests in hunting and outdoor recreation, had formalized their annual December trip to Wyoming in 1976. Every year, same week, same location, same ritual. They'd lease national forest land near Ridge Pass, hire local guides, set up a base camp with heated tents and a cook who prepared meals. Spend 5 days hunting elk in country that felt wild, even though they were never more than an hour from civilization. For them, it was recreation, adventure, a chance to feel rugged and self-reliant while still returning each evening to hot food and warm beds and the comfort of knowing rescue was always available if something went wrong. What they didn't know was that Richard Hartwell had been planning something beyond the hunting trip. For 2 years, he'd been quietly acquiring debt instruments secured by Wyoming ranch property. He'd partnered with a Denver investment group that specialized in distressed rural real estate, buying mortgages from struggling banks at discount rates, then either restructuring the loans at higher interest or foreclosing and selling the land to developers. It was legal, profitable, and completely impersonal. Just business. No malice, no personal vendetta, just the application of capital to opportunities that presented themselves in a changing market. In September 1988, Hartwell's company had purchased a mortgage held by First Mountain Bank of Jackson. The mortgage was on 640 acres of ranch land owned by Thomas Bennett, originally taken out in 1973. When Bennett needed capital to buy new equipment and expand his cattle operation. The original loan had been $15,000 at 8% interest. Bennett had made payments faithfully for 15 years. By 1988, he owed $6,300 remaining balance, but the loan documents contained acceleration clauses that most ranchers didn't fully understand. Provisions that allowed the note holder to demand full payment under certain conditions. Hartwell's company had purchased the note for $4,200. They immediately invoked the acceleration clause based on a technicality regarding property tax payment timing. The Bennetts had paid their property taxes, but they'd paid them 4 days after the due date that year because Thomas had been in the hospital with pneumonia. 4 days. That was the violation that triggered the acceleration. On November 3rd, 1988, Thomas Bennett received a certified letter informing him that the full remaining balance of $6,300 was now due immediately. He had 30 days to pay or face foreclosure proceedings. For a rancher operating on margins measured in hundreds of dollars per month, coming up with $6,300 in 30 days was impossible. He'd have to sell cattle at distressed prices in November when nobody was buying. He'd have to liquidate equipment he needed to operate. There was no way. The letter also informed him that if the property went to foreclosure, it would be sold at auction with a minimum bid of $60,000. Reflecting current market value for development purposes rather than agricultural value. Thomas read the letter 3 times, sitting at his kitchen table while Catherine washed dishes and pretended not to notice the way his hands were shaking. He read it again that night after she'd gone to bed. He read it the next morning with his coffee. The words didn't change, the numbers didn't change. The deadline didn't change, 30 days. $6,300. Or lose everything his family had built since 1882. He drove to Jackson the next day, November 4th, walked into First Mountain Bank, where his family had done business for 50 years. The branch manager was new, transferred from Cheyenne 6 months earlier, didn't know the Bennett family history. He explained politely that the bank no longer held the note, that Hartwell Development Corporation now owned it, that there was nothing the bank could do. He suggested Thomas contact Hartwell directly to discuss payment options. Thomas called Hartwell Development from a payphone outside the bank. Spent 40 minutes being transferred between secretaries and assistants before finally reaching someone who claimed authority to discuss the matter. The man's name was Gerald Briggs, Vice President of Acquisitions. He had a pleasant voice, professional manner, complete indifference to Thomas's situation. He explained that the acceleration was standard procedure, that the company would be happy to work out a payment plan if Thomas could make a substantial down payment and agree to monthly installments at 15% interest. When Thomas asked what constituted a substantial down payment, Briggs said $4,000 minimum. Thomas had $800 in his checking account. That was everything. He asked if there was any flexibility, any way to extend the deadline, any consideration for the fact that his family had held this land for over a century. Briggs said he understood this was difficult, but the company had its own obligations to its investors. If Thomas couldn't meet the payment requirements, the property would proceed to foreclosure. The auction was scheduled for December 16th. Thomas hung up the phone and stood in the November cold, staring at mountains that had witnessed 4 generations of Bennett family history. He drove home, told Catherine what he'd learned, watched her face age. 10 years in the time it took him to explain. That night he sat in the dark in his kitchen, long after she'd gone to bed. He thought about his great-grandfather Ezra, building the first cabin with his own hands, surviving that first winter when survival wasn't guaranteed. Thought about his grandfather William, expanding the ranch acre by acre, fence post by fence post, irrigation ditch by irrigation ditch. Thought about his father Robert working until a heart attack killed him at 73 because stopping work meant admitting you were finished. Thought about what he'd promised each of them in the unspoken way that promises were made between Bennett men, that the land would continue, that the family would continue, that everything they'd built wouldn't be erased by men in offices 300 miles away who saw it all as nothing but numbers on paper, assets to be liquidated, opportunities to be exploited. He thought about his 3 sons, Robert with his 2 daughters who'd never know what it meant to have roots going back a century, James, who'd come back from Vietnam, broken, and found healing in the work of maintaining what his ancestors had built. Michael, who'd tried to leave but couldn't because the land was in his blood the same way it was in Thomas's blood, the same way it had been in every Bennett who'd ever called these 640 acres home. He thought about codes that his father had taught him. Never let anyone take what's yours without a fight. Never back down when your family's survival is at stake. Never forget that some things matter more than laws written by people who've never known what it means to break your back working land that your great-grandfather died to claim. And he thought about the men who were taking his land. Not faceless corporations, but actual human beings who'd made the choice to destroy his family for profit. Men who had everything and wanted more. Men who could walk away from this transaction and forget it happened, while the Bennetts lost everything that mattered. Men who'd be in his county in December hunting elk on national forest land 20 miles from the ranch they were stealing, treating Wyoming like a playground, treating his life like a business opportunity. The decision formed slowly, not in rage, not in the heat of emotion, but in the cold calculation that came from understanding that some violations existed outside the law's ability to address, that sometimes justice required methods that civilization condemned, but that older codes demanded. He didn't discuss it with Catherine, didn't explain it to his sons, just started planning the way he'd planned every significant action of his adult life. By late November, Thomas knew everything about the Denver Hunting Club's annual trip. He'd made calls to the Forest Service pretending to inquire about hunting permits, had learned which areas had been leased for December 10th through 15th. He'd driven to the site twice, studied the terrain, understood exactly where they'd camp based on access roads and water sources and the kind of comfort that wealthy hunters expected. Ridge Pass was the only route between their camp and the best elk habitat. They'd have to traverse it daily. He studied avalanche conditions with the expertise of someone who'd spent 61 years reading snow and mountain weather. The snowpack that December was building in layers, each storm adding weight, each temperature fluctuation creating planes of weakness between layers. By mid-December, the slopes above Ridge Pass would be loaded with snow that wanted to slide but hadn't found a trigger yet. Natural avalanches happened. Everyone knew this. Sometimes slopes that looked stable would release without warning. Sometimes entire mountainsides came down and buried everything below. It was the nature of mountains, the price of living in avalanche country. If someone knew exactly where to place charges, exactly how much explosive to use, exactly when to detonate, based on slope loading and trigger points, they could make unstable snow do what unstable snow wanted to do anyway. They could make murder look like nature. They could eliminate threats and have it ruled an act of God. The old mining camps in the mountains still had supplies left from when silver and copper brought miners into these hills in the 1890s. Dynamite didn't go bad if stored properly. Detonators were simple, reliable technology. Wire was cheap and available. Knowledge was what mattered. Understanding slopes and snow and the physics of pressure and release. Thomas had that knowledge, had spent his entire life watching mountains, learning what made them stable and what made them killers. His sons had the same knowledge, inherited the same way they'd inherited eye color and the Bennett name. They didn't need to discuss what was being planned. They simply understood when their father started making trips into the high country in late November that something was happening, something that required silence and shared understanding and the willingness to cross boundaries that civilization drew, but mountains ignored. December 1st brought the first major snowstorm of the season. 18 inches fell over 3 days, wind piling drifts, 8 feet deep against the north side of buildings, temperatures dropping to 12 below zero at night. Thomas and his sons worked through it, feeding cattle, breaking ice, maintaining the daily rhythms that kept the ranch functional. But they also made other trips, up into the high country, where old mining roads led to abandoned camps, where shafts sunk in the 1890s still held equipment left behind when the ore ran out, and the miners moved on. Robert went first, driving his truck as far as the snow allowed, then hiking the last 2 miles on snowshoes. He came back with dynamite wrapped in oilcloth, sticks that had been stored properly, and remained stable after 90 years in the dark. James made the second trip, retrieved detonators and wire from a different location, spread the risk across multiple sites in case anyone noticed. Michael stayed at the ranch, maintained normal routines, created alibis through visibility. They were careful. They'd grown up hearing stories about how their great-grandfather had avoided federal marshals during Prohibition, how their grandfather had hidden black market beef during rationing in World War II. The Bennett family understood operational security before the term existed. They understood that successful operations required patience, planning, and the discipline to do nothing that drew attention. By December 7th, they had everything they needed. 12 sticks of dynamite, detonators, 500 feet of wire, basic tools. Thomas spent 2 days studying the slopes above Ridge Pass with binoculars from 3 different vantage points. He mapped the snow layers in his mind, identified the weak plains where temperature gradients had created instability, calculated the minimum force required to trigger release. He'd seen avalanches before, had witnessed what happened when millions of pounds of snow decided to move, had pulled bodies from the debris after a slide in 1967, killed 2 hunters who'd camped in the wrong drainage. He knew exactly what he was planning to do to 13 men. Knew they'd have no chance once the slope released. Knew they'd be buried under snow that would set like concrete within minutes, suffocating them in darkness while their lungs filled with ice crystals. He knew this and he planned it anyway because the alternative was losing everything his family had built. On December 10th, the Denver Hunting Club arrived right on schedule. Thomas watched from 5 miles away through binoculars as they set up their camp. Heated tents, generator satellite phone for emergencies, they had guides, had a cook, had all the equipment that money could buy. They looked happy. Men on vacation, freed temporarily from offices and boardrooms and the responsibilities of their regular lives. They didn't know that one of them, Richard Hartwell, had signed foreclosure papers 3 days earlier. Didn't know that the auction of Bennett land was scheduled for December 16th, 6 days from now. Didn't know that the property they were stealing would fund more hunting trips, more vacations, more years of treating Wyoming like a playground. Thomas watched them through the binoculars and felt nothing. No rage, no hatred, just the cold clarity that came from absolute certainty about what needed to happen. That night he and his sons drove separate routes to Ridge Pass. They met at 2 a.m. under a quarter moon that provided just enough light to work by. The temperature was 6 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind had died to almost nothing, which was rare and precious in the high country in December. They worked for 4 hours, placing charges at 6 different points along the cornice that hung above the pass. Thomas had calculated everything: the weight of the snow, the angle of the slope, the weakest points in the snowpack. He placed the charges exactly where physics and experience told him they'd have maximum effect. They buried the wire, ran it to a firing point 300 yards away where they'd have clear sight lines and complete safety when the slope released. They worked in silence, communicating with hand signals and shared understanding. By 6 a.m, they were done. They hiked back to their trucks using different routes, drove home separately, arrived at the ranch as the sun was coming up. Catherine had breakfast ready: eggs, bacon, coffee. She asked no questions. served the food, and watched her husband and sons eat like they'd been up all night doing normal ranch work, instead of preparing to commit mass murder. The Denver hunters spent December 11th hunting in areas south of Ridge Pass. Thomas monitored their movements through a scanning radio tuned to the frequencies their guides used. They saw elk, took some shots, missed more than they hit. That evening around the campfire, they planned the next day's hunt. The guides recommended working the drainage north of Ridge Pass, where a large herd had been spotted. To reach it, they'd need to traverse the pass at first light. December 12th dawned clear and cold. Temperature at sunrise was 4 degrees Fahrenheit. No wind. Perfect conditions for hunting. Perfect conditions for what Thomas had planned. The 13 hunters left their camp at 7:15 in the morning. Thomas watched through binoculars from his position 300 yards from the firing point, watched them string out in a line as they started the traverse across Ridge Pass. They moved slowly, carefully, men in their 40s and 50s navigating terrain that required attention. They were 200 yards into the crossing when Thomas decided it was time. He didn't hesitate, didn't second guess, didn't allow himself to think about wives or children or the lives he was about to end. He connected the detonator to the wire, checked the circuit one final time, and pushed the plunger. The charges went off simultaneously. 6 explosions in rapid sequence, muffled by snow, but powerful enough to fracture the cornice along a line 200 yards wide. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. The hunters had stopped moving, confused by the sounds, looking around, trying to identify the source. Then the slope released. The entire mountainside above them simply came apart. Millions of pounds of snow and ice began moving, slowly at first, then accelerating with the inevitability of gravity. The hunters had maybe 5 seconds to understand what was happening. Some tried to run downhill. Some tried to run laterally out of the path. None of them made it. The avalanche was 300 yards wide and moving 40 miles per hour by the time it reached them. It hit like a solid wall, a tsunami of snow and ice that swept them away like insects. The sound was enormous. A freight train combined with thunder. The roar of millions of pounds of matter in motion. The slide ran for 800 vertical feet before the slope angle decreased enough for it to slow and stop. When the snow settled, when the sound finally faded and silence returned to the mountains, there was nothing visible on the surface. No men, no equipment, no sign that 13 human beings had been there moments before. Just fresh avalanche debris, jumbled blocks of snow the size of cars, a quarter-mile of destruction that looked entirely natural to anyone who didn't know better. Thomas packed up the detonator and wire, hiked back to his truck, drove home. It was 9:47 in the morning. By noon, the guides at base camp knew something was wrong. The hunters had taken radios but weren't responding. By 1 in the afternoon, the guides hiked to Ridge Pass and saw the avalanche debris. They called for rescue immediately. Teton County Search and Rescue mobilized within 30 minutes. Wyoming State Police were notified. FBI was contacted because the victims were from out of state. By 3 in the afternoon, helicopters were overhead, and rescue teams were probing the debris with long poles, looking for any sign of survivors. They found the first body at 4:20. Robert Keller, the orthopedic surgeon, buried under 8 feet of snow, dead from asphyxiation. Over the next 3 days, they recovered all 13 bodies. Some had died from trauma, necks broken, or skulls crushed by the force of impact. Most had died from suffocation, buried alive under snow that packed around them and hardened, unable to dig themselves out, unable to breathe, dying in darkness and cold and complete helplessness. The last body recovered was Richard Hartwell, found on December 15th, under 12 feet of debris. The initial official finding was natural avalanche. Tragic but not uncommon in the high country during heavy snow years. The Denver media covered it extensively. 13 prominent citizens killed in Wyoming hunting accident. Families were devastated, funerals were scheduled. The Teton County Sheriff expressed condolences and noted that avalanches were an inherent risk of mountain recreation. But the FBI wasn't satisfied. Special Agent Raymond Cross, assigned to the case because it involved multiple interstate fatalities, ordered a thorough investigation of the debris field. On December 19th, forensic teams found fragments of detonator wire. On December 20th, they found residue from explosives. By December 22nd, they knew this wasn't a natural avalanche. Someone had deliberately triggered it. Someone had murdered 13 men and tried to make it look like an act of nature. The investigation shifted immediately. This was now a mass murder investigation, the largest in Wyoming state history. FBI brought in specialists, avalanche experts who could read the debris field and determine exactly where charges had been placed, explosives experts who could identify the type of dynamite used, investigators who started interviewing everyone in the county who might have knowledge or motive. The net started closing around the Bennett family faster than Thomas had anticipated. He'd thought he had more time. The FBI investigation moved with the methodical efficiency of an organization that had unlimited resources and complete determination. Special Agent Raymond Cross had worked major cases before, had investigated organized crime hits and domestic terrorism, but the Ridge Pass avalanche was different. 13 victims, all killed simultaneously, through a method that required specialized knowledge most people didn't possess. The evidence was clear. Someone had placed explosive charges at precise points along the cornice, had calculated exactly where to position them for maximum effect, had detonated them at the exact moment when the hunters were in the kill zone. This wasn't crime of passion or spontaneous violence. This was premeditated mass murder executed with the kind of planning that suggested military training or lifelong familiarity with mountain terrain and avalanche dynamics. By December 23rd, the investigation had identified a short list of potential suspects, people who lived in Teton County, who had the knowledge to engineer an avalanche, who had access to old mining sites where explosives might still be stored. The list contained 47 names. Cross and his team started working through them systematically, interviewing, checking alibis, looking for motive. Thomas Bennett's name appeared on the list on December 26th, not because anyone suspected him specifically, but because he fit the profile. Fourth-generation rancher, 61 years old, Vietnam, veteran with combat experience, lifetime resident, who knew every drainage and ridge in the county. The agents who drove out to the Bennett Ranch on December 27th We're just doing routine interviews, checking boxes, expecting nothing." Thomas met them at the door. Catherine stood behind him in the kitchen, her face carefully neutral. The agents introduced themselves, explained they were talking to everyone who knew the backcountry, asked if Thomas had noticed anything unusual in the days before the avalanche. Thomas answered their questions calmly. No, he hadn't been up near Ridge Pass in weeks. No, he hadn't seen anyone suspicious in the area. No, he didn't know any of the Denver hunters personally. Yes, he understood avalanches were dangerous, and he was careful when working in the high country during winter. The agents thanked him for his time and left. But one of them, a younger agent named Michael Torres, noticed something as they were walking back to their vehicle. Fresh tire tracks in the snow leading from the barn toward an old logging road that headed into the national forest. Thomas said he hadn't been up in the high country, but someone had been driving that direction recently, maybe within the last week. Torres made a note in his report. On December 30th, FBI forensics completed their analysis of the explosive residue found in the debris field. The dynamite was old, manufactured sometime in the late 1800s or early 1900s based on the chemical composition. That narrowed the source considerably. There weren't many places where century-old explosives would still be stored and accessible. Cross ordered a comprehensive search of abandoned mining sites within 50 miles of Ridge Pass. On January 4th, 1989, a search team found an old shaft near Clover Creek that showed signs of recent disturbance. Boot prints in the dust, leading to a storage room where dynamite had been kept. Some sticks were missing. Boot prints were photographed and measured. Size 11, tread pattern consistent with Danner work boots, common among ranchers and outdoor workers, but distinctive enough to match if they found the actual boots. On January 7th, agents returned to the Bennett ranch with a search warrant. Thomas watched from the porch as they searched his barn, his vehicles, his equipment shed. They found the boots in Robert's truck. Size 11 Danners with the same tread pattern as the prints at the mine. They found traces of dynamite residue in the bed of James's pickup. They found wire in Michael's workshop that matched the gauge of wire fragments found at the detonation site. The evidence was circumstantial but accumulating. Cross brought the entire family in for questioning on January 9th. They were interviewed separately in rooms at the Jackson Police Department. Robert said nothing, invoked his right to an attorney immediately. James did the same. Michael started to answer questions, but stopped when he realized where they were leading. Thomas sat across from Cross for 6 hours. The agent laid out the evidence piece by piece. The boot prints, the residue, the wire, the tire tracks, the knowledge required to engineer an avalanche. He explained that they knew someone in the Bennett family was involved, that the evidence was overwhelming. Thomas listened to everything Cross said. Then Thomas spoke for the first time in 6 hours. He said one sentence. "That land has been ours since 1882. Cross arrested all 4 Bennett men that evening. The trial began on June 5th, 1989, in federal court in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The venue had been moved from Jackson because pretrial publicity made finding an impartial jury impossible in Teton County. The prosecution was led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Fielding, 42 years old, who'd handled major cases and had a conviction rate above 90%. The defense was led by Harold Blackstone, 67 years old, one of Wyoming's most respected criminal defense attorneys. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. Forensic experts testified about the explosive residue, the wire, the detonation site. Avalanche specialists explained how the charges had been placed with precision that required intimate knowledge of snow physics and mountain terrain. FBI agents detailed the investigation, the boot prints, the tire tracks. Family members of the 13 victims testified about their loss, about fathers and husbands and sons who'd gone on a hunting trip and never came home. Patricia Hartwell, Richard's widow, testified for 2 hours about their 28 years of marriage, about grandchildren he'd never meet. The courtroom was silent except for the sound of people crying. The defense didn't dispute the evidence. Instead, Blackstone built a case around context, around understanding how 4 men who'd never been in serious trouble could commit mass murder. He presented evidence of the foreclosure, of the acceleration clause that Richard Hartwell's company had used to take land the Bennetts had held for over a century. He called economic experts who testified about the transformation of rural Wyoming, about how ranching families were being systematically displaced by wealthy outsiders. He called historians who explained the significance of homesteaded land, about what it meant to families who'd built their entire identity around property they'd claimed from wilderness. He put Catherine Bennett on the stand. She was 60 years old, worn down by months of watching her family destroyed. She testified about what the land meant, about 4 generations of Bennett family history, about watching her husband and sons realize that everything they were was being taken by legal paperwork they couldn't fight. She cried on the stand when she talked about Thomas sitting in the dark in their kitchen, night after night in November, trying to find a legal way to save the ranch. There was no legal way. The system had failed them completely. Blackstone's closing argument lasted 3 hours. He didn't ask for acquittal. Instead, he asked the jury to understand that these were desperate men pushed to extremes by circumstances that the law didn't recognize or protect. He quoted Thomas's statement to Agent Cross. "That land has been ours since 1882. 7 words that contained everything the trial was really about. He asked the jury to consider what they would do if everything that defined who they were was being legally stolen with no recourse. He didn't excuse the violence. He asked them to understand it. Fielding's closing was shorter. 13 men dead, 13 families destroyed. The law was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. The verdict should be guilty on all counts. The jury deliberated for 14 hours over 2 days. On June 23, 1989, they returned guilty verdicts on all counts for all 4 defendants. The courtroom erupted. Families of the victims wept with relief. Catherine Bennett collapsed. The sentencing hearing was held 2 weeks later. On July 7, 1989, Judge Bennett issued sentences. Thomas Bennett, life in prison without possibility of parole. Robert James and Michael Bennett, 25 years to life each. Before being led away, Thomas made a statement. He said he was sorry for their loss, but he wasn't sorry for defending his family's legacy. The land had been theirs. The law had failed to protect what mattered. The decades that followed scattered everyone across time and distance. Catherine Bennett never visited her husband or sons in prison. She stayed on the ranch alone for 3 years, but without her husband and sons, the work was impossible. The cattle were sold in 1990. The foreclosure finally proceeded in March 1991. The Bennett Ranch sold at auction for $1,200,000 to a California development company. Catherine received nothing because the property had been seized as proceeds of crime. She moved to a small apartment in Jackson, lived on Social Security, worked part-time at a grocery store. She died on February 3, 1994, 64 years old, of a heart attack. She was buried in the family cemetery on what had been Bennett land. Thomas wasn't allowed to attend, even under guard. Thomas William Bennett spent the rest of his life in Wyoming State Penitentiary in Rawlins. He was a model prisoner, caused no trouble, worked in the prison library. He refused all interview requests, never spoke publicly about the case. He died on March 19th, 2015, at age 88 of pneumonia complications. He'd served 26 years. His body was cremated. The ashes were scattered illegally on what had been Bennett land by someone who was never identified. Robert Bennett was released on parole in August 2014 after serving 25 years. He was 58 years old. His wife Ellen had divorced him in 1992, had remarried, had moved to Montana with their daughters who wanted nothing to do with their father. Robert moved to Billings, got a job as a mechanic, lives alone. He's 73 now, works part-time, keeps to himself. James Bennett is still imprisoned at Wyoming State Penitentiary. He's 65 years old, has been denied parole 3 times. He suffers from PTSD related to Vietnam, combined with guilt over the Avalanche. His next parole hearing is scheduled for 2026. Michael Bennett was paroled in October 2017 after serving 28 years. He was 55. He disappeared immediately after release. No known address, no contact with family. Some say he moved to Alaska. Nobody knows for certain. The 13 victims' families scattered across the decades in their own ways. Patricia Hartwell sold their house and moved to Arizona. She never remarried. She established a scholarship fund in her husband's name that has helped 63 students attend college. She's 87 now, lives in Scottsdale. She says she's forgiven the Bennetts not because they deserved forgiveness, but because carrying hatred for 35 years was destroying her. The other families followed similar patterns. Some found ways to move forward. Others never recovered. James Mitchell's son became an advocate for Avalanche safety education. David Preston's daughter wrote a book about the case. Robert Keller's wife drank herself to death within 5 years. The collective trauma rippled through 2 generations. The Bennett Ranch was developed into luxury estates in 1993. The original house was torn down. The barn was removed. The family cemetery was preserved by court order, but surrounded now by properties worth millions. Families live there who've never heard the Bennett name, who have no idea that 4 generations of history were erased to create their mountain retreats. Ridge Pass, where 13 men died, looks no different than it did in 1988. Snow still accumulates. Avalanches still happen. Tourists ski the area unaware. Hunters traverse the pass. There's no memorial, no plaque. The mountains keep their secrets. Was Thomas Bennett a mass murderer? Yes. He eliminated 13 men with premeditation and planning, placed explosive charges with surgical precision, detonated them at the exact moment to ensure maximum casualties. He transformed his 3 sons into accomplices, destroyed their futures along with his own. By any legal definition, by any moral framework that values human life. Thomas Bennett was a monster. But was he also a desperate father watching his family's entire legacy stolen by legal paperwork he couldn't fight? Defending the only inheritance he had to give his children in a world where the law protected money but not heritage? Also, yes, the uncomfortable truth is both things can be true simultaneously. And that's the most disturbing part because it forces us to ask questions we'd rather avoid. What would we do in his place? How far would we go to protect what defines us when the system offers no protection? Does justice exist when authorities recognize property rights, but not the emotional significance of that property to people who've worked it for generations? Is there a line between righteous anger and unforgivable violence? Or do impossible circumstances erase that line entirely? Thomas Bennett crossed a boundary no human being should cross, but that boundary existed in a world where a man's heritage could disappear overnight through legal mechanisms he didn't understand, where foreclosure paperwork mattered more than 4 generations of family history, where the law said his land was just property with a dollar value rather than identity and legacy and connection to ancestors. The system failed at every level. An economy that abandoned rural America, leaving families with no legal way to maintain the land their ancestors had claimed. Banks that sold mortgages to investment companies that cared nothing for the people behind the loans. Courts that recognized legal technicalities but not the human cost of foreclosure. In that failure, Thomas Bennett found justification for violence, found permission in codes older than federal law, codes that said a man defends what's his regardless of what lawyers decide. Was he right? No. 13 families would say no through tears that haven't dried in 35 years. The law says no through sentences that kept 4 men in cages for decades. But was the system that pushed him to violence also wrong? Also, yes. There's no easy answer, no clear moral, no satisfying conclusion, just a simple and terrible truth. Violence breeds more violence. Broken systems create desperate people. And sometimes the line between protecting your family and becoming a monster becomes so thin it disappears entirely, leaving only corpses and questions and children who grow up without fathers, on both sides of a tragedy that destroyed everyone it touched. 35 years have passed since that December morning. Rural America hasn't healed. Families still face impossible choices when systems fail. Every year, ranches that have been in families for generations are sold to wealthy outsiders. Every year, some people choose violence. The underlying truth remains. Push people far enough, take away everything that gives their lives meaning, and some will push back. The Bennett Ranch exists now only in photographs and memories. Its luxury estates and vacation homes. Ezra Bennett's cabin is gone. The barn is gone. The cemetery remains but feels out of place, surrounded by wealth. Ridge Pass, where 13 men died, holds no memory. On cold December mornings, it looks exactly as it did. Beautiful, dangerous, indifferent. Mountains don't remember human tragedy. They just exist, patient and eternal, until only one question remains, one each of us must answer for ourselves. At what point does protecting what we love transform us into the very thing we're fighting against? If this story made you think about justice, legacy, and the price we pay when systems fail, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe for more true stories that challenge what we think we know. Comment below. Where do you draw the line? What would you have done? Because these stories aren't just history. They're happening right now, where systems fail and desperation takes hold. Until next time, remember, the monsters we fear aren't always born that way. Sometimes they're made. One foreclosure notice, one broken code, one December morning at a time.